He shoved her hand away and sneered, "People like you don't belong here," as the entire market went silent. The sting of his words hit harder than any shove, not just to her, but to everyone watching who did nothing. But Maya Ellis didn't fight back. She simply stood tall, calm, and composed, as if daring truth itself to speak for her. Within minutes, that same crowd would discover the woman he humiliated was their own state governor. Would you have stayed silent or stepped in? If this moment stirs your sense of justice, hit like and share this story. Now let's dive in. I was there that morning right on Main Street where the Willow Creek Farmers Market spills into the sidewalk like a river of voices. Late autumn, crisp air coffee drifting out of the carts, a little brass bell on the bakery tent ringing every time someone bought a loaf. Kids tugged on sleeves for cinnamon rolls. A fiddler was warming up near the pumpkins. It was one of those simple Saturdays you hold with two hands so it doesn't slip away. She didn't arrive like a headline. She came like any neighbor, tall, composed, a white shirt tucked clean into light khakis, a wide-brimmed hat shading careful eyes. I'd seen her before at town halls on TV, on the edge of a podium with flags behind her. But here she was, just a woman choosing dahlias. Maya Ellis. You could feel the courtesy on her, the way she said good morning, and meant it, the way she asked the flower seller about his mother's hip, the way she paid in cash, and tucked the receipt away like a habit learned long before staff and calendars. We weren't staring. Not yet. Most people didn't place her. Friends passed with reusable bags and jokes about late frost. I hung back under the canvas edge of the coffee stand, letting the cup warm my hands, watching how some people carry quiet like a kind of dignity. Maya did. She didn't hurry. She didn't scan for attention. She just moved through the market like someone who still believed in Saturdays. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, turned a fraction away from the crowd, and said in a low, even voice, "Governor's office. Tell them I'll call back." Then she slipped the phone into her tote and smiled at the honey vendor as if nothing important had interrupted a small, important morning. That was the first thing that took my breath, how deliberately ordinary she wanted to be. I learned later she'd asked her security team to give her space. Just one peaceful morning, she told them. And isn't that what we all want sometimes, to run errands without being anyone special? To belong without earning it every step. Across the street near the bank's freestanding ATM, a patrol car idled. The window was down. Officer Hank Rowley, 30-something square jaw arms like he lived at the gym, was listening to dispatch. You could see it in the tilt of his head, the pen tapping against the steering wheel. A report had just come through. Possible suspicious person filming near the ATM, the voice crackled. Nothing dramatic. In a small town that could be a teenager on a skateboard trying a trick for Instagram, it could be nothing. Hank glanced toward the market and spotted Maya. She was standing just at the seam where the bank's brick met the quilting booth, holding her phone near her list, copying a recipe from the chalkboard at the coffee cart. You know how a single assumption can snap something gentle in two? You could almost hear it, like the faint click of a safety off. He put the car in park. I remember the way the fiddler stopped mid-note when Hank stepped onto the pavement. His boots thudded in that slow, heavy rhythm cops use when they want the room to recognize them. He didn't call out from a respectful distance. He closed the space like it belonged to him. "Ma'am," he said at first, which still had a chance of going right. But we've all heard a tone that curdles the word it rides on. This was that. Maya looked up, polite, curious. "Good morning, officer." He cut his eyes to her phone. "What are you doing?" She held up the list, a half smile, the civility that asks you to meet it halfway. "Writing down the scone recipe from the board. My niece loves these." "Mm-hmm." He said, a sound that doesn't believe you. He took another step too close for market manners. Behind him, the bank camera blinked red. "We got a report about someone recording near the ATM." "I haven't been near the ATM," she said, still calm. "I was over here with the flowers." There was a version of the morning where that explanation would have been enough. But some people don't want enough. They want someone to be less. Hank squared his shoulders. The leather creaked. Something like a smirk tugged one corner of his mouth. "Where do you think you are, lady?" he said, voice lifting so it could carry. Heads turned. A cinnamon roll paused mid-bite. "People like you should know your place." It takes a second for words like that to land. They fall, they echo, then they find the places inside you where older echoes live. I felt it in my chest. So did the flower seller, who set his pruning shears down very carefully like he didn't trust his hands. Maya didn't flinch. That was the second thing that took my breath. Not bravado, something steadier. She stood as if the ground agreed with her, as if dignity were not a debate. Her eyes were steady, not glassy or wet. Hurt lives there, you could tell, but hurt that knows its own weather. Is there a reason you're talking to me like that, officer? She asked. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There's a power in measured words. They leave room for the listener to hear themselves. A few of us took a step closer without meaning to. The honey vendor's hand hovered over his sample spoon. Somewhere the espresso machine hissed and went quiet. The air thinned the way it does before a storm. Hank angled himself so he half-blocked her from the market, as if to move the scene into his jurisdiction. "Show me your ID," he said. "Now." He didn't ask. He issued it like a ticket. "I'll show you whatever you need if you can tell me what I've done wrong," Maya said. Not a challenge. A request for reason. I watched her thumb brush a loose petal on the bouquet, a small mercy to her own, shaking that she refused to show. He leaned in so the brim of her hat nearly touched his chest. "Don't get smart with me." That was when the market truly went silent, the kind of hush that remembers other hushes older and uglier. A boy with a skateboard froze with one wheel still spinning. Mrs. Carter, the church pianist who sells apple butter, lifted her phone with a tremor she masked as a cough. We all felt the balance of the morning tip. If you'd asked me the night before whether this town could turn on itself in broad daylight, I would have laughed. But injustice doesn't need permission. It needs only an opening and a witness too slow or too polite to fill it. Hank took another breath, like a man about to say something he had practiced before. "Where do you think you are?" he repeated louder. "People like you." That's when the cinnamon roll dropped. That's when the fiddler lowered his bow. That's when the first thumb found the red record circle and pressed. And that's when I realized none of us were just shoppers anymore. We were about to become evidence. Maya lifted her chin a fraction enough to keep her voice from breaking. "Officer," she said evenly, "is there a reason you're talking to me like that?" The question hung there between them, thin as wire taut as the morning's last piece. Then it snapped. He didn't soften. If anything, the silence fed him. "Show me your ID," Hank said, voice hard enough to chip paint. "Are you filming people's cars?" Maya kept her hands where he could see them open, steady palms relaxed around the paper list. "No," she said, almost apologetic for the trouble he'd brought with him. She pointed with two fingers toward the chalkboard by the coffee cart. "I was writing down a recipe from that board. My niece likes their orange scones. That would have ended it in a kinder town or on a kinder day." But Hank glanced at her shirt, her hat, the clean press of her clothes, and picked a fight with the facts. Writing recipes, he scoffed, letting the words carry. In that outfit, you trying to impress someone, it wasn't a question. It was a performance. Heads turned. Shoppers pretended to examine jars they weren't going to buy. The brass bell on the bakery table went still because the seller's hand had stopped ringing it. Somewhere behind me, the fiddler tried one small note and thought better of it. I heard Mrs. Carter before I saw her. Age gives you a way of speaking that threads a room without raising a voice. "She's not doing anything wrong," she said, plain as scripture. Hank didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Maya like a cat keeps its eyes on a bird that hasn't decided whether to fly. The gap between them was a step and a choice. He took both. "Show me your ID," he said again, lower, leaning into the threat that lives inside uniform authority, "or I'll take you in." Maya's answer wasn't a flourish. It was a landing. Respect is a two-way street. You could feel the line catch him under the ribs. Not because it was clever, but because it was true. Truth is abrasive when you've spent your morning polishing your power. His jaw flexed. "Don't get smart." She kept her eyes level. "I'm not," she said, and there was no sting in it. "I'm asking for the same courtesy you'd give anyone." "What makes you think you're anyone?" he snapped. That was when a little boy reached for his mother's hand and missed, and his fingers caught the wicker of Maya's basket. It tipped. The bouquet slid out and kissed the pavement. White petals scattered like small shocked birds. People always talk about the words they remember, but I remember that sound, the soft, helpless rustle of flowers letting go. Maya bent to lift the basket, not hurried, not humiliated, just careful. Like dignity was something you pick up piece by piece and never let someone else decide how you hold it. Her hat brim dipped. The light caught her cheekbone. I could see her swallow once and place a dahlia back where it belonged. Hank mistook gentleness for weakness. Bullies often do. He shifted his stance, sliding a boot forward to own more ground. "Enough stalling, ID. Now." "I'll show it," Maya said, "if you tell me what I've done wrong." Hank barked a humorless laugh. "You think that's how this works?" I asked. "You obey." A murmur rose. The market wasn't a jury yet, but it was waking up to the idea. Words moved like wind over grain. What did she do? He came in hot. "That's Maya, isn't it?" "No, can't be. Leave her alone. Phones came up like a second sun, one lens 2.5, a scatter of red circles, blinking record. Mrs. Carter took one small step closer, shoulders squared the way old fighters stand when they don't want to fight but won't surrender the ground. Officer, she said gentle, as a mother at a sickbed, this isn't right. Hank cut his glance her way for the first time, a flicker of annoyance. Ma'am, mind your business. It is my business, she said, and that was the first time I heard steel in her voice. This is my town. Then you should want it safe, he said. And I keep it safe by asking questions. Questions aren't the problem, Maya said, still crouched by the spilled petals. She rose and set the basket steady on her arm. It's the way you ask them. Lady, he said, the way I ask is the way I ask. Then maybe, she said, that's the problem. He stepped in. The edge of his vest brushed the brim of her hat. Surveillance is a posture before it's a policy. He made his body into a wall. Behind him, the bank's camera kept blinking like a witness too frightened to speak. The crowd swelled without touching them, a ring of breath and phones and held tongues. Final time, Hank said each word, a knuckle. ID. Or we go downtown. Maya didn't reach for her wallet. She reached for something steadier. Officer, she said, I'll cooperate, but I won't be talked to like I'm less. Something pride training an audience made him show his teeth. You think you get to set the terms? No, she said softly. I think the terms were set before either of us got here. Respect is not negotiable. The honey vendor, a quiet man who minded scales and sweetness, drew in a breath he'd been holding since Hank arrived. She told you twice, he muttered, not quite brave, not quite silent. Hank heard him anyway. You stay out of it. That's when the kid with the skateboard, the one whose wheel was still spinning in my peripheral vision, nudged it with his sneaker. The plastic ticked against the asphalt, a metronome for the moment. Tick, tick, tick. No one laughed. No one moved. Time does this strange thing in public. Shame, it crawls across your back and pins you without laying a hand. Maya shifted the basket higher on her arm. One stem had snapped. She cradled it with a thumb and forefinger, as if even broken beauty deserved to be held kindly. Officer, she said, if you're going to take me in, say so. But don't try to take my dignity first. He blinked, and for the first time a hairline crack showed in the mask. You don't get to decide what's dignity. No, she said, but I get to keep mine. A woman near the coffee cart whispered God, and meant it like a prayer and a warning both. Turn around, Hank ordered. For what charge? Maya asked. For he stalled, realized he needed a word, and grabbed the first one in reach. For refusing to comply. I'm not refusing, she said. I'm asking you to be specific. Specific. He laughed again, louder, like volume could make up for reason. Okay, specific. You fit the description of what she said. He didn't say, he didn't need to. The words hung there empty and full at once. The petal at the rim of her basket slid loose and floated down. It landed on his boot. He didn't notice. We did. I wish I could tell you we stepped in then. I wish I could say the market found its voice and the day turned human again. But fear ate its courage. We watched our screens instead of each other. Maya broke the spell not with drama, but with a breath. She inhaled like a swimmer before a long underwater push. I'll come with you, she said, if that's what you've decided. But hear me the way you're speaking to me. Enough, he snapped, slicing her sentence. Hands where I can see them. She obeyed. Not because he asked, because she chose not to give him what he was hunting for. As she lifted her hands, the basket slipped. It hit the ground with a soft thud, and this time the flowers didn't scatter, they surrendered. They spread like a white flag at her feet. The market breathed in sharp and collective. I felt anger rise like heat off asphalt. Not the kind that burns fast and dies, the kind that remembers. Hank stepped forward to claim the moment as proof of his control. That's it, he said. We're done talking. Maya looked him in the eye, standing over the spilt tenderness of her mourning. We were never talking, she said. You were deciding. A murmur rolled the length of the tents. Mrs.? Carter held her phone steadier now. The boy's skateboard ticked on. Somewhere a bell rang once, then again, as if someone finally remembered the bread. And that's how the first line was crossed, not with sirens or a shout, but with a basket tipped and a sentence that told the truth out loud. He lost whatever was left of his patience. You think you're better than us, Hank barked, his voice, slicing through the market's uneasy quiet. Maya stood still, hands loose at her sides, the basket of fallen flowers between them. No, she said softly, but I deserve respect like anyone else. Her tone wasn't defiant. It was measured like someone choosing each word with care because she knew the cost of saying them wrong. But to Hank, even calm sounded like challenge. Respect, he spat. You people always demand that. Those 3 words, you people, crack something invisible. A few shoppers gasped, others pretended to check their phones. The line between fear and shame blurred across every face. Mrs. Carter's hands shook as she lifted her phone again. I saw her thumb tremble above the red record circle before it pressed down. History doesn't announce itself. It just begins recording. Hank noticed the movement. Ma'am, put that away, he snapped. She didn't. Her knuckles were pale, but her eyes stayed steady. Then from somewhere near the coffee cart, a young man's voice broke through. Hey, she didn't do anything. The sentence cracked the tension wide open. The fiddler flinched. The baker froze. For 1 second, it looked like decency might win. Mind your business, Hank shouted back, spinning on his heel. The veins in his neck stood out like wire. His hand hovered near his belt, not the weapon, just close enough to make the air around him electric. Maya didn't move. She didn't beg or argue. She just drew in a slow, visible breath, her shoulders rising and falling like a tide that refused to crash. Silence doesn't mean weakness, she said, barely above a whisper. You could have heard a seed drop on the pavement. The crowd felt it, the quiet strength in her voice, the way it landed heavier than Hank's shouting ever could. Even the wind seemed to pause, brushing through the awnings with a shiver that made every loose flag ripple like a warning. Hank sneered, unsure whether to laugh or lash out. Big words, he said. Let's see if they help you downtown. Mrs. Carter lowered her phone just enough to catch her breath, then raised it higher. Behind her, 3 more cameras came up. One woman murmured, she's so calm. Calm, yes, but not untouched. You could see the hurt flicker across Maya's face, a flash she quickly buried beneath composure. She met Hank's stare not with defiance, but with a kind of quiet sorrow, the kind that asks, why are we still here? The young man from before stepped forward again, fists balled but trembling. She's not resisting, he said. Everyone can see that. Back off, Hank barked. Last warning. But this time, nobody stepped back. The market, once a casual swirl of voices and smells, had turned into a single heartbeat of disbelief. Maya exhaled long and slow. The sound of it carried further than any shout could. You don't have to do this, she said. We both know that. Her words landed like stones on water, quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Hank looked around, realizing too late that every phone was pointed his way, every silence now recording him. Still, he pressed forward, pride louder than reason. You people, he muttered again like a curse he'd practiced. And that was when the world seemed to narrow, the sound of wind pushing through the tents, the soft flutter of petals still on the ground, the faint metallic ping of a flagpole in the distance. The market wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting everyone in it, what they were willing to stand for and what they were willing to excuse. No one spoke. No one laughed. Every sound had been swallowed by the moment. I remember thinking how strange it was that a man could look so powerful and yet so small, yelling down at a woman who never raised her voice once. Then Maya did something I still can't forget. She looked straight at him, not angry, not afraid, just certain, and said, you can shout all you want, but you can't unhear the truth. The words didn't echo. They sank deep and final into every watching soul. And for the first time that morning, Hank hesitated. The wind picked up, brushing through the trees, stirring the petals at her feet into a small spiral of white. The sound of it, soft, steady, unyielding, was the only thing that moved. The air was tight enough to hum. Everyone knew something irreversible had just begun. It happened fast, but not so fast that we could say we didn't see it coming. A young man near the bakery stall raised his phone, high voice shaking, but clear, I'm recording this. That one sentence broke the fragile spell of silence. Heads turned toward him. Some gasped, others looked down, afraid to be seen looking up. Hank pivoted sharply, his glare slicing through the crowd. Put that down, he barked, the authority in his tone wrapping around every syllable like a threat. Or I'll arrest you too. You could almost feel the weight of his words pressing against the air, daring anyone to challenge him. The young man didn't lower his phone, but his arm trembled. A woman nearby whispered, don't, as if even courage could be punished here. Then came the smallest voice in the crowd, a frail, trembling whisper that somehow carried farther than all the shouting. An elderly woman, her hands wrapped around a paper cup, shook her head slowly. God help us, she murmured. This looks like the old days again. That sentence hit harder than Hank's voice ever could. The old days didn't need explaining. We all knew what she meant. Every heart there understood her history, the memories she'd never wanted to see again, men in uniform deciding who belonged and who didn't. Hank turned back to Maya, eyes flashing with irritation, as though her calmness had somehow offended him. He reached forward and grabbed her arm, not violently but rough enough to make the entire crowd inhale at once. The sudden motion sent the coffee cup in her other hand, tumbling its contents, spilling dark across her white shirt. For a heartbeat, it was all movement and sound, the splash, the gasp, the soft patter of liquid on the pavement. Maya froze, blinking at the spreading stain on her chest. She didn't shout. She didn't pull away. She just looked up at him, steady and unbroken. "You can hurt me," she said quietly, "but you can't erase the truth." Her words landed heavy like stones dropped in still water. Ripples spread across the market, shame, anger, disbelief, all mixing together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Hank straightened, jaw tight, like a man who'd realized too late that the line he crossed had witnesses. And that's when it happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through everything, loud, clear, and shaking with conviction. Enough. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration. The sound echoed against the awnings through the stalls, bounced off the brick walls of the cafe. The market that had been holding its breath finally exhaled. People started moving, not toward violence, but toward presence. One woman stepped closer, her phone lifted. A man whispered, "Get her name," to someone beside him. The atmosphere changed from passive watching to collective reckoning. Hank looked around, realizing the tide had turned, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. But pride is louder than reason. He pressed his hand to the radio clipped at his shoulder. "Dispatch," he said, voice tightening, "possible suspect, refusing ID, requesting backup." Maya's eyebrows lifted just slightly as if to say suspect, but she didn't speak. From the distance came the first faint wail of sirens, thin, hollow, growing closer. The sound sliced through the air like a blade. People started backing away the way instinct makes you step aside when power comes roaring down the road. Mrs. Carter whispered to no one in particular. He called for more. Her voice cracked on the last word. The sirens grew louder, closer, until they seemed to circle the marketplace. Dust rose from the street as two patrol cars pulled in fast tires, screeching lights spinning red and blue into everyone's faces. The hum of morning turned into a storm. Hank motioned for one of the arriving officers. "Got a possible register here," he said, still clinging to the word like a shield. The other officer hesitated, glancing between Hank and Maya. "What's the charge?" Refusing to comply, Hank snapped. Maya spoke for the first time since the spill. Her tone was low but unwavering. "You mean refusing to surrender my dignity?" The crowd murmured, some nodding, some clutching their phones tighter. The tension wasn't just visible. It was audible, humming beneath every breath, every heart beating in sync with outrage. "Ma'am, turn around," Hank ordered, gripping her arm again. This time, the young man with the phone stepped forward. "She didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice breaking under the strain. "Back off," Hank yelled, pointing at him. "You're obstructing." But the crowd didn't move away. They held their ground, an unspoken solidarity rising between strangers. The air was thick with the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. Maya closed her eyes, drawing in one long breath, and when she opened them, she wasn't afraid. "If you must take me," she said, "then let the world see it clearly." Hank snapped the cuffs around her wrists. The metal clicked, a sound too sharp, too final. The crowd reacted as one, a wave of gasps and angry shouts breaking loose. "Are you serious?" someone yelled. "She didn't even resist," cried another. Mrs. Carter, still filming, whispered, "Keep recording. Don't you dare stop." The second officer looked uncertain, the kind of unease that grows when right and wrong trade uniforms. Maya stood still. Wrists bound, her white shirt stained, and her eyes shining not with tears, but with something steadier, older. "You can arrest my body," she said softly, almost to herself, "but not the truth that follows you." Hank pushed her toward the car as the crowd erupted. The sound of voices rose like thunder, outraged, pleading, helpless. And through it all, the wind picked up again, rustling the tents, scattering the fallen petals in slow circles around her feet. I remember thinking, this isn't just a moment. This was the spark, the kind that doesn't burn out when the sirens fade, but smolders, until the truth it touches finally catches fire. The inside of the cruiser smelled like vinyl and rain. The market noise had vanished behind the closed doors, replaced by the low hum of the engine and the clack of Hank's fingers on the steering wheel. Maya sat in the back, her wrists cuffed loosely in front of her eyes, fixed on the blur of trees sliding past the window. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She just breathed steady, like she was holding on to something no one could take. She had it coming, Hank muttered almost to himself, but loud enough for the rookie beside him to hear. People like that always push it too far. Daniel's young, clean uniform, still new enough to care, didn't answer. His knuckles tightened around his notepad. He'd seen the video lights, the faces in the crowd, the coffee stains spreading across her shirt. None of it looked like had it coming. Maya caught his reflection in the glass. "You're quiet," she said softly. He hesitated. "I just didn't think it needed to go that way." Hank snorted. "That's why you're still a rookie. You give them an inch, they take the whole street." Maya turned her head just slightly enough for her voice to reach them. "Respect isn't an inch, Officer Rowley. It's supposed to be the ground we all stand on." Hank's jaw tightened. "Save it. You'll have your chance to talk downtown." She looked back out the window, letting the rhythm of the wipers trace across the glass. Outside, the road curved past fields still wet from the morning dew. For a moment, it almost looked peaceful again. That's when her mind slipped somewhere far away to another morning, another voice in uniform. She must have been 9. Her father, still in his Sunday best, had taken her to a diner on the south side, a place that served biscuits the size of his hand. They never made it inside. The man behind the counter pointed at a sign half hidden behind the pie rack. "Closed for cleaning," it said. But the smell of bacon and coffee was everywhere. "We're not serving today," the man added. Her father smiled that tired, polite smile and said, "We can wait." The man said, "No need. You people never get the hint." Maya remembered the way her father's fingers tensed around her shoulder. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, he just said, "Come on, baby, let's go." That was the first time she learned what silence could cost and what it could save. The hum of the engine brought her back. Daniels glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Why don't you say something," he asked quietly, "about what happened back there?" She met his eyes through the reflection. "Because sometimes silence speaks louder than anger." He looked down, not sure whether he understood or just didn't want to. Outside, the radio crackled with static and dispatch chatter, but no one spoke. Hank drove like he was trying to outpace the noise in his own head. Daniels stared out the windshield, trying to decide whether doing nothing was the same as being complicit. Maya leaned back against the seat, the cuffs cool against her wrists. Her reflection in the window looked calm, but her heart ached with the weight of memory. The diner, her father's quiet retreat, the years between that moment and this one. She'd built her life on believing that change was possible, that if you carried yourself with dignity long enough, the world might finally learn to mirror it. But here she was, back in the same silence, only this time the whole world might be watching. The rain started again, light and persistent, tapping the roof like fingers on a drum. Daniels reached for the radio, hesitated, then turned it down. He didn't want to miss what might happen next. Maya broke the quiet first. "You ever seen injustice up close, Officer Daniels?" He hesitated, voice low. "Not like that." "Then remember how it felt," she said, "because forgetting is how it keeps happening." Her tone wasn't bitter. It was weary, almost parental. Daniels swallowed hard and nodded, eyes fixed ahead. Hank muttered something under his breath, but it didn't matter. The power in the car had shifted quietly, invisibly. The woman in the back seat, stained, shirt-bound hands, steady voice held more composure than the man behind the wheel. For the rest of that ride, no one spoke again. The rain softened. The lights of the station appeared ahead, glowing pale through the mist. And as they pulled in, Daniels caught Maya's reflection one last time, her face calm, her eyes distant but alive. In that stillness, something in him broke open. Respect, guilt, a seed of reckoning. He couldn't name it yet, but he knew it had started. That's when I realized something too. Sometimes the loudest sound of all is the silence left after dignity refuses to die. By noon, the story had already slipped out of Willow Creek and into the bloodstream of the nation. Someone had uploaded the video from the market, shaky hands, harsh sunlight, Hank's voice cutting through the air like a blade. The title under it read, "Local Cop Humiliates Black Woman at Willow Creek Market." At first it spread the way rumors do, slowly, quietly, almost guilty for existing. Then someone commented, "Wait, isn't that Governor Ellis?" That question was gasoline. Within an hour, the clip hit every social feed, replayed, paused, analyzed frame by frame. The woman with the coffee-stained blouse, the calm eyes, the voice that said, "You can hurt me, but you can't erase the truth." Viewers started matching her to press photos, campaign footage, speeches about reform. The resemblance wasn't just close. It was her. By noon, every major network was replaying the same footage, different anchors, same disbelief. The headline crawled across the bottom of every screen, "Governor Maya Ellis confronted and detained by local police." They slowed the video down. They looped the moment her shirt was stained, her wrists cuffed, and across America's living rooms, something ancient and ugly stirred a memory too familiar to explain, too painful to forget. At the Willow Creek police station, the air inside was heavy with nervous chatter. Phones rang. The dispatcher's radio crackled nonstop. Hank leaned back in his chair, grinning at the screen. "Another faker," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "They all say there's somebody once they get caught." Daniels didn't laugh. He stared at the paused image on the monitor, Maya's face tilted toward the camera, the quiet strength in her expression. There was no faker in that look. He turned toward the computer, typing her name into the state database almost on instinct. The result popped up instantly. Governor Maya Ellis, Office of the State Executive. Daniels froze. For a moment, he couldn't even breathe. His mouth went dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. He whispered it without meaning to. "She's the governor." The room went dead quiet. One officer looked up from his desk. Another stopped mid-call. Even the hum of the vending machine seemed to stall. Hank turned his chair, frowning. "What did you say?" Daniels swallowed. "That woman you arrested? She's the governor of this state." Hank blinked, half laughing at first, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. Daniels spun the monitor around. The photo on the screen, Maya Ellis at her inauguration hand, raised, same eyes, same calm, burned away every ounce of his smugness. Color drained from Hank's face. That's not possible." "It's her," Daniels said. "Positive ID. Official record." No one spoke. The silence was suffocating. Then someone whispered, "Chief Green's going to lose his mind." As if summoned by the words, the chief appeared in the doorway, a broad-shouldered man with years of service, and a look that could stop a bar fight before it began. But even his steps faltered when he saw the screen. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," he said, voice low. No one answered. Daniels turned the monitor toward him. The chief's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping once at his temple. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled through his nose. "Where is she now?" Hank finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Holding room." "She wouldn't, she didn't. I thought she was." "You thought?" The chief cut him off, the words sharp enough to slice the air. "You didn't know." He turned to Daniels. "Get the footage ready. I want every second of that encounter logged. Now." Then, quieter almost to himself, "God help us all." Down the hall behind a metal door, in a pane of fog glass, Maya sat alone in the interrogation room. Her wrists were free now, but faint red marks still ringed her skin. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a sound that had no sympathy, no bias, no pause. She looked at her reflection in the two-way mirror. The fluorescent light above her head flickered, once humming like a tired conscience. Maybe silence isn't enough anymore, she thought. She had spent a lifetime mastering composure, believing that quiet endurance could teach the world decency. But as she looked into that mirror, seeing her own calm face staring back from under the weight of injustice, she felt something shift. Not anger, clarity. Outside the door, footsteps gathered. The chief's voice, low and tight, ordered everyone out of the corridor. Then came the metallic click of the handle turning. The door opened. Chief Green stepped inside. His face had lost all color. Behind him, the hallway buzzed with reporters shouting questions, the echo of camera flashes bouncing off the walls. "Maya," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Governor Ellis, ma'am." He couldn't finish the sentence. She looked up at him, steady and silent, and for the first time that day, it wasn't her silence that filled the room, it was his guilt. And as that realization hung between them, the storm that started with one phone in a farmer's market finally arrived inside the walls of the station. When the chief stepped fully into that small gray room, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the lights, the muffled chaos outside, even the clock on the wall, all of it faded under the weight of what he knew. "Governor Ellis," Chief Green said, the words trembling out of him. His voice cracked halfway through her title, the same way a man's conscience cracks when it realizes it's too late. I had no idea." Maya didn't look up right away. She kept her gaze fixed on her folded hands, wrists still marked faintly from the cuffs. When she finally raised her eyes, her expression wasn't angry. It was something heavier, disappointment, quiet and devastating. Across the room, Hank leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a nervous laugh caught somewhere between denial and panic. "Governor," he scoffed, forcing a grin that didn't fit his face. "Sure she is." No one answered him. The chief's radio crackled, a voice on the other end, barely audible over the noise in the hallway. "State office en route, confirming identification." Seconds later, the door burst open again. Two staffers from the governor's office entered, breathless, one clutching a leather portfolio, the other holding an embossed folder with the state seal. The taller of the two, a woman in a dark blazer, spoke quickly. "This is Governor Maya Ellis," she said, her voice steady official. She opened the folder, sliding the ID across the table. "State-issued identification. Signed authorization from the executive office. And I strongly suggest you release her immediately." The chief's hand hovered above the table, fingers trembling as they touched the ID. There was no mistaking it. Her photograph. Her signature. The raised seal that could end a dozen careers with a single phone call. Chief Green looked at Maya again, his throat tightening. "Release her," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, firm this time, "Now." Daniels moved first. His hands shook slightly as he fumbled with the key. The click of the cuffs coming loose echoed through the room like thunder in a church. Hank didn't move. His skin had gone pale, every ounce of confidence drained from him. "I didn't know," he whispered. Maya turned toward him slowly. Her eyes met his, not sharp, not cold, but unbearably clear. "That's the problem," she said. "You never care to know." Her voice wasn't loud, but the truth inside it hit harder than any shout could. Hank looked down, staring at his boots, as if the ground itself was indicting him. Daniel stepped back, head bowed. He couldn't look at her either. His face carried a mix of shame and something else, a deep, gnawing regret. The chief ran a hand over his face, the weight of decades of service pressing down like judgment. "Governor, I can't express how." Maya cut him off gently. "How sorry you are," she asked, her tone not cruel, just painfully honest. "Chief Green, I've spent my entire career hearing men apologize for the systems they never fixed." He nodded, eyes wet now, the authority in his posture folding into something human. "You're right," he said, "and I don't expect forgiveness. But I swear to you this will be handled." Outside, the sound of shouting voices and flashing cameras bled through the walls. Reporters were already at the station entrance, the name Governor Ellis bouncing off every surface like a thunderclap. Inside the room, Maya stood up. The silence around her shifted, the kind that happens when everyone realizes they're no longer the ones in control. She straightened her jacket, brushed the coffee stain on her shirt, and looked at the chief. "Handled," she repeated softly. "Make sure that word means something this time." Chief Green gave a slow, solemn nod. As she stepped toward the door, Hank stumbled forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Governor, please. I didn't know who you were." Maya paused, hand resting on the doorframe. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said, her tone calm but sharp as glass. "You just needed to remember who you were." For a long moment, no one moved. Daniels spoke next, his voice cracking under the weight of truth. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if there's any way to make this right." She turned to him. "Start by telling the truth," she said. "All of it." He nodded, eyes down, guilt written in the way his shoulders slumped. Then she opened the door. The hallway erupted in noise flashes, questions, the roar of a world just realizing what had happened in its quiet corner. But Maya didn't flinch. She walked through the chaos as if it parted for her, a sea of shame and revelation. Behind her, the chief stood frozen, still staring at the empty chair where she'd sat minutes ago, the same chair they used for suspects. Hank's reflection lingered in the two-way mirror, pale and hollow, a man seeing himself for the first time. And in that moment, every cop in that building learned that authority isn't power, decency is. I remember standing there watching her leave and feeling the shift in the air, the sound of a system cracking, the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. The world outside was already roaring, but inside it was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes right before reckoning. The door opened with a slow, heavy groan, the kind that seemed to echo through every room of the station. And then she stepped out. Maya Ellis. No handcuffs, no escort. Just the governor of the state, walking back into daylight. The afternoon sun hit her face warm and golden, catching the faint coffee stains still spread across her blouse. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the sirens, the shouting reporters, even the hum of the city, all of it silenced by the sight of her standing there. The crowd outside, pressed behind the barricades, froze. Phones lifted. Gasps rippled through the air. And then someone near the front, a woman with tears already in her eyes, whispered, "That's her. That's the woman from the video." Another voice followed louder, this time cracking with disbelief. "That's her. She's the governor." It was like striking a match. The whisper became a wave. "She's the governor. Oh my God, it is her." The cop arrested the governor. Every eye turned toward her. The same eyes that had watched her humiliation, only hours earlier, now wide, with recognition, shame, awe. The shock spread across faces, like light breaking through fog. Maya didn't speak. She just took a slow step forward, shoulders back, chin lifted, the calm gravity of someone who carried more than her own pain. The cameras flashed, hundreds of them, but she didn't flinch. Chief Green appeared behind her, his uniform crisp under the same sunlight that made his regret impossible to hide. He stopped just outside the doorway, facing the sea of microphones and reporters. His voice came low, trembling but clear. "This department," he said, "owes Governor Ellis and every citizen an apology." Then in front of the cameras, he did what no one expected. He removed his cap and bowed his head. Not a small nod, a full visible bow of remorse. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to still out of respect or shock, maybe both. I swear I saw Maya glance at him, not with triumph, but with something gentler. Understanding. From the crowd, a small voice broke through the hush, the kind of sound that makes the entire world turn. "Mom," a little girl asked, pointing toward Maya. "She's the governor." Her mother knelt down, one arm wrapped protectively around her. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly, "and she's a good one." Maya smiled when she heard that. It wasn't the kind of smile people practice for cameras. It was tired, warm, human. The kind that forgives without saying the word out loud. She stepped closer to the microphones, and for a second, it looked like she might deliver a statement. Instead, she said something simple, barely raised above the noise. "I'm still just a person." That was it. No speech, no outrage. Just truth, raw and quiet, the kind that cuts through everything else. The silence afterward was heavier than applause. But then one person began to clap. Slow, hesitant. Then another joined, and another. In less than a minute, the whole crowd was clapping a rough, uneven rhythm that grew fuller, stronger, until it filled the street like thunder rolling through a valley. It wasn't the kind of applause you hear after victory. It was the sound of collective shame turning into collective respect, a sound that said, "We saw what happened, and we're better for having seen it." Maya stood there through it all, her hand resting gently over her heart, her gaze drifting across faces. Some tearful, some solemn, all changed. Chief Green stayed where he was, hat still in his hands, the picture of a man learning too late what integrity costs. Daniel stood beside him, head bowed. When the applause finally softened, Maya looked over her shoulder and met Daniel's eyes. He gave a small, wordless nod, a quiet apology, maybe a promise. The crowd began to part as she walked down the steps. No police escort, no barrier now. Just open space. Some reached out as she passed, not to touch her but to acknowledge her nods. Murmurs of respect, one man whispering, "We're sorry." As she reached the street, the sunset poured over everything, turning the station's windows into molten gold. For a heartbeat, the light wrapped around her like armor. She paused once more before getting into the car that had come to take her back to the Capitol. Turning toward the crowd, she said softly, "Thank you for watching. Don't stop watching." And then she was gone, leaving behind the sound of hands still clapping, echoing through the narrow streets like a prayer for justice that had finally found its voice. I remember thinking as the car drove off, that wasn't applause for power. It was for decency. For the reminder that no title, no rank, and no uniform can measure a person's worth better than the way they choose to stand, even when standing alone. Across the country, the air felt different that evening. Screens glowed in living rooms, diners, and barbershops, each one tuned to the same broadcast. News anchors spoke quietly, their usual rhythm softened by the gravity of what had unfolded in Willow Creek. Across the nation, one of them said millions are waiting to hear from Governor Maya Ellis. The camera cut to the podium in the Capitol Rotunda. The room was silent except for the click of camera shutters and the faint hum of live microphones. Then she appeared, Maya, dressed in the same stained blouse she'd worn that morning, refusing to hide the mark that had started it all. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence breathe first, the same silence that had carried her through humiliation and into history. When she finally began, her voice was calm, resonant, and heartbreakingly steady. "Prejudice doesn't just live in the past," she said. "It breathes every time silence allows it." You could almost feel the nation inhale together. She continued, "I stayed quiet once because I thought dignity meant restraint. But dignity means truth. It means speaking when silence becomes surrender. What happened today wasn't just about me. It was about what we've allowed to linger in the corners of our comfort." Her words rolled through living rooms and down quiet streets, through police stations and classrooms, into the hearts of people who'd learned to look away. At the Willow Creek precinct, Daniel sat alone in the break room, the TV flickering blue against his uniform. His reflection looked older, somehow heavier. When the camera panned to Maya's face, he nodded once, almost to himself. A moment later, the network cut to an interview segment him. Daniel's live on camera standing in front of the same police station door Maya had walked out of hours earlier. His hands were clasped tightly, his voice trembling but clear. "I was there," he said. "I saw what happened. I didn't stop it, and that's on me. But I won't stay silent again." The governor didn't fight back. She just stood her ground. That's strength. That's what real law should protect. The feed split-screen Maya on the podium, Daniel's outside the station, and somehow they looked like two sides of the same truth finally meeting in the middle. Meanwhile, in a small house just a few blocks from the market, Mrs. Carter sat on her floral couch phone buzzing with messages from friends who'd seen her footage online. Her wrinkled hands shook as she turned the volume up. On screen, Maya's voice filled her living room. "We can't change what we refuse to face." Mrs. Carter blinked back tears and whispered to the empty room. "Back then I kept my head down. Not anymore." Outside her window, neighbors were talking again about courage, about respect, about what it means to finally see. And somewhere else in a dimly lit apartment, Hank Rowley sat in silence. The television flickered across his face, washing him in blue light. On the table in front of him lay his badge glinting faintly beside an untouched beer. Maya's voice played from the screen. "Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet act of choosing to be better than yesterday." Hank stared at the badge for a long time before picking it up, turning it over in his hand. Then, without a word, he set it down hard enough to make it ring against the wood and leaned back, exhaling the kind of breath that only regret can shape. He didn't reach for the beer. He didn't speak. But for the first time, he listened. Back at the Capitol, Maya sat behind her desk later that night. Papers were spread before her: drafts, proposals, reports, but her pen hovered over one document in particular. The headline read, "The Ellis Reform Act." Her signature curved across the page in slow, deliberate strokes. With that motion, she codified everything that had been shouted, whispered, recorded, and replayed. A law to end discriminatory profiling in public service, a promise written into the bones of the state. Outside the Capitol, people gathered again not to protest but to witness. Candles flickered in the dark, the same kind of light that once burned in her father's hands when he marched decades ago. The next morning, headlines flooded the nation. Governor Ellis signs historic anti-discrimination bill. From humiliation to reform, one woman's stand changes the state. The day's silence spoke louder than hate. News anchors called it the Ellis moment. Churches read her words from pulpits. Schools replayed her speech during assemblies. And for the first time in a long time, people weren't just watching justice, they were talking about it. In the final shot of that day's broadcast, the camera found her again, Maya standing on the Capitol steps, the sunlight warm on her face. She looked calm, not triumphant, just certain. And the reporter's voice closed the segment with a single line that summed it all up. "Sometimes the most powerful change begins with a whisper that refuses to die." That whisper, hers, was now everywhere. In classrooms, in precincts, in homes that had once been too quiet for too long. Justice didn't roar that day. It echoed. A year passed before she came back. It was a mild Sunday morning in Willow Creek, the kind of day that looked borrowed from memory. The air carried the scent of baked bread and sun-warmed fruit the same way it had that morning when everything changed. Only this time, there were no sirens, no shouting, no tension pressing down on the crowd. Just life, ordinary, unhurried, and whole again. Maya Ellis walked through the market alone the same way she had a year ago. No security detail, no flashing cameras, no aides hovering nearby. Just her in a plain linen shirt, sunglasses tucked into her collar, a quiet smile on her face. People saw her before she spoke. Some waved, others stepped closer, not with the awe they once had, but with warmth, with gratitude. The place that had once watched her humiliation now glowed with pride. The flower stand was still there. So was the baker, the fiddler, the coffee cart. But the space between the booths felt lighter now, as if the town had exhaled the guilt it once carried. "Governor Ellis," someone called, but she shook her head gently. "Maya's fine," she said, smiling. "It's a market, not a press room." Laughter rippled softly through the crowd. Even the children, too young to understand what had happened, seemed to sense something sacred in the way everyone looked at her. From behind a row of potted plants, Mrs. Carter appeared older but steady, her posture proud. In her hands, she carried a small basket lined with wildflowers, white and gold, freshly picked. She approached with that same quiet dignity that had once lifted her phone in trembling defiance. "These are for you, Governor," she said, her voice thick with warmth. For that day, Maya accepted the basket, her eyes glistening under the golden light. "Thank you," she said softly. "But they belong to all of us now." Mrs. Carter smiled. "Maybe, But you reminded us how to hold them. The two women stood there for a long moment, one who had endured, the other who had witnessed. Around them, the market moved gently, a current of laughter, music, and sunlight weaving between the stalls. Maya looked around, taking in the scene. "It's beautiful," she said, "how it healed." Mrs. Carter nodded. "Healing takes truth first," she said, "then time." Maya brushed a petal with her thumb, her gaze far away. "Justice doesn't always roar," she said. "Sometimes it whispers, and that's enough." The words hung in the air, carried softly by the breeze, finding their way through the crowd like a prayer too familiar to fade. A child's laughter rose somewhere near the fruit stand. The fiddler struck up an old tune, light and tender. The flags above the stalls fluttered lazily in the Sunday. It was ordinary again, but not the same. Nothing that wakes a conscience ever is. As Maya turned to leave, a man stepped aside to let her pass. "Good to see you back, ma'am," he said. "The place feels right again." She smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." And then she walked on the crowd, parting quietly, respectfully, not because of her title, but because of what she had come to represent. The camera, if there had been one, would have lingered on the petals in her basket the way they glowed under the golden light. The wind picked up again, stirring the market tents, carrying with it the sound of laughter, the smell of coffee, the small, steady pulse of peace. And if you listen closely, really listen, you could almost hear it, the soft hum of a town that had once looked away, now learning to look up. That same market now whispers of justice every Sunday morning. And somehow, that whisper feels louder than any roar. And that's where this story leaves its mark, not in anger, but in understanding. It reminds us that justice doesn't always roar in the courtroom. Sometimes it whispers in the choices we make every day to treat others with dignity, to speak up, and to keep our hearts open. If this story touched you, please hit like and share it with someone who believes in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Your support means the world to us, and gives the Mr. Max Stories team the strength to keep creating powerful, meaningful stories that shine a light on truth, courage, and compassion. This is more than a story, it's a voice for justice. You're part of that voice now. This is Mr. Max Stories, where every whisper of truth still echoes.